The world is rife with deception and evil. One does not need to be deeply perceptive to notice that there is much in the world that has gone wrong, fundamentally upset the balance of light and darkness, justice and injustice. But these words that I speak are themselves deceptive. I can assure you that I say one thing and you think I mean another. It is not through everyday language and speech by which thoughts and feelings are communicated in their purity of essence. There is yet another state of awareness by which words may be transmitted between those who speak the truth. And here I go again, speaking words heavy laden with a weight of various multi-layered meanings, good, evil, truth, and falsehood. We are always certain that we know what these words mean, what they signify, and what they truly are in and of themselves. You may take whatever I say with a grain of salt or with a warning label to ensure that you keep hold of your own precious ideas and beliefs as you listen to these words. After all, one must not be duped, or heaven forbid, persuaded out of one's own deeply held convictions. We would want none of that. So let us remain asleep. Persuasion is a cunning mistress, whispering sweet words as she empties your purse. This ironclad stance of skepticism and a fear of being deceived by deceptive words is a fundamental axiom of modernity. Paul Ricoeur had spoken of the hermeneutics of suspicion and identified the three modern prophets of suspicion, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud. Each, in his own way, believed that man is in a perpetual state of false consciousness, defined broadly as a consciousness that is incorrect or misaligned from reality. Each of these thinkers asks us to view the world in which we inhabit with a suspicious and critical lens, unmasking all appearances to reveal the stark, ugly, and self-serving vanities that lie hidden beneath the surface. But let us give the devil his due, for surely there are such things as hypocrisy and selfishness. And is it also not true that esotericism gives way to precisely that sort of thinking? Not to mention all theological exegesis that sees the words written and seeks to give it some deeper significance. We are similarly guilty, for we have also used the word veiling unveiling, to look behind the common appearance of things and reveal their hidden numinosity. But there is in fact a distinction that is made between the hermeneutics of suspicion and what is called the hermeneutics of faith. One seeks to supplant a meaning by tearing it down or explaining it away, exultant in its casting off of inauthenticity and deception. The other feels exaltation in building additional layers of meaning into it, adding nuance and texture, and increasing the inherent numinosity of a given text. The problem with skepticism and modern-day skeptics is that they are half-hearted practitioners of their art. They do not take their own philosophical tools and apply them wholly and completely. For if one truly wants to be skeptical of the world, one must take it to the end of one's thinking, and finally, in the final analysis, apply skepticism upon itself. Everything is an ouroboros, everything consumes itself, and when this is realized deeply within one's heart, and we mean deeply, you come to the realization that emptiness and fullness are one and the same. On a theological level, apophaticism burns away all attributes of the divine with its own fire. It seeks to destroy definitions because any such definition applied to the divine seeks to constrain it. In the opposite direction, cataphaticism asserts the majesty of the divine by emphasizing its illimitable attributes, resulting in an ineffable fullness. So where are we going with all of this? Perhaps ultimately this is not the right question, or a very deceptive question at least, because we are not really going anywhere at all. Every word uttered, every verbalized speech act, every thought that enters your mind leads you down a particular road, the road to the real. There is no escaping the real. You can deny it as much as you like. You can claim that people are under the spell of false consciousness, but you are always on that road to the real. Sometimes we move further away, sometimes we come closer, but all roads, whether paved through song or singing, have ultimate reality as its pivot point. To see the world as nothing but false perceptions and appearances and delusion is not inherently misguided, but to cast off these appearances and phenomena as somehow unreal is where the error lies. This shows a lack of faith. What a powerful word faith is. It is like the Logos, with its countless variants and transformations of meanings. But without faith, or Pistis, nothing is possible. The integrity of the real would dissolve. Sometime between the 2nd and 3rd century AD, the Chaldean oracles were compiled as a collection of mystical poetic texts, which only survive today in fragments. It is of such importance for Neoplatonists that Franz Cumont has called it La Bible des théurges platoniciens, the Bible of the Platonic theurgists. They are either attributed to Julian the Chaldean and or his son Julian the Theurgist. Some scholars debate the possibility that either the Julians, both father and son, actually immigrated to Rome from Chaldea or were of Syrian origin. Others describe the title of Chaldean as an indication that they were inspired and spiritually attuned to the wisdom and magic of the East. For Chaldean is a very broad term. In antiquity, it was used interchangeably with the word Assyrian, but it essentially identifies someone from an Iranian, Babylonian, Mesopotamian syncretism of cultures. The younger Julian was a contemporary of the Middle Platonist Numenius, and there is a striking similarity and parallelism between the Chaldean oracles and the fragments of Numenius. But what is interesting about this connection of Numenius' writings and the Julians is that they, along with Iamblichus, were strong opponents to the rationalizing tendencies of later Platonists. As Peter Kingsley says, quote, "It is no coincidence that is exactly what Numenius, a figure of special significance in the subsequent evolution of Platonism, claimed he was setting out to do in the 2nd century AD. He insisted that the only way to rescue Platonism from the academic hair-splitting into which, according to him, it had degenerated, was to trace it back to its origins in the cults, rituals, and doctrines of the Near East, aided by the guiding inspiration of early Pythagoreanism." These Pythagorean influences will become very important, as we shall soon see. As mentioned earlier on with regard to apophatic and cataphatic modes of approaching the divine, it should be said that Middle Platonism balances both approaches and emphasizes the expression of the via negativa at one moment and the via positiva the next. Chaldean Oracle 21 speaks cataphatically, quote, "For he is all things, but intelligibly. Pant esti gar alla noetos." Chaldean Oracle 178 speaks apophatically, the inaccessible recesses of the mind. Let us be brief with respect to the Chaldean oracles, for our intention is not to discuss the Chaldean system as a whole, but to discuss the foundational principles upon which all of theurgy rests, in which all of reality rests. Only in one fragment, fragment 46, do we find reference to this principle, as quoted by Proclus. It is as follows: "It is necessary to propose the virtues which from creation purify and lead back to God, faith, truth, and love, that praiseworthy triad. Pistis kai aletheia kai eros." Exactly in this order: faith, truth, and love. In the Chaldean system, there are what are known as 3 teletarchs, which are translated literally as masters of initiation. And for each of these teletarchs that rules the 3 worlds of Chaldean cosmology, from the material to the ethereal and finally the imperial realms, there is a corresponding virtue that each teletarch imbues, which grants the theurgist anagoge toward God. Judging by the order of these virtues, it suggests that you cannot ascend to union with the divine if you do not possess the kindled eros that elevates the mutual desire between the lover and the beloved. You cannot have this ascending eros without a notion of truth, aletheia. For now, we will leave truth aside, but let us say for the moment that the truth can only be apprehended if you have pistis, or faith. And here we return to our initial pathway of thought. Pistis is not faith in a doctrine or a set of ideas, nor necessarily of revelation. In the Bible, Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." You can see here a very close connection between the word faith and the word hope. Even in the Chaldean oracles, there is a strong sense of interdependence between them. In fact, in Porphyry's letter to Marcella, he is making elpis, or hope, into a fourth virtue, effectively forming a tetrad of virtues. The scholar Hans Louis had suggested that this hope was perhaps based on the promise of a, quote, blessed afterlife, which would be derived from the mysteries. What most scholars agree on, however, is that this triad of virtues should not be understood as the Pauline triad of faith, hope, and charity, as these are primarily spiritual qualities, whereas the triad of faith, truth, and love are actual entities as well as theurgic virtues that function as conduits to God. Proclus sees these virtues as purifying, and above all, he considers faith to be the most supreme of the three. Even if the Chaldean system sees eros emanating first from the Father, I believe it is right that Proclus emphasizes the supremacy of faith. For faith is the catalytic principle that activates the other two virtues to aid in ascent. And it is from this side of the divide, let us say, reliant on our receptivity, where theurgy begins. It is paramount and of the utmost importance. Hans Louis states, "The assertion that pistis is the highest degree of knowledge is due to Proclus, if not already to Iamblichus. The former prizes this virtue above gnosis, i.e. philosophy, identifying it with the theurgy dynamis, and explains that through pistis aletheia eros, everything is conjoined with the divine. Thus, Platonism, in its ultimate stage, professes the superiority of illumined faith over knowledge, ending with the same doctrine with which Christian theology had started." Further on, Louis astutely notes that Chaldean pistis is assuredly not of Platonic origin, since Plato's works value knowledge over faith, and Plato himself considers faith as an inferior form of knowledge. Now this to me is the key, the bridge to understanding what pistis really is. Proclus is absolutely right to depart from the slavish Neoplatonic devotion to Platonic principles and to tap into the pre-Platonic and pre-Socratic and Pythagorean foundation from which Plato received and transmitted to posterity teachings from his predecessors, albeit in adulterated form. Rather than resting on theoria and abstract conceptual systems, to determine the truth of something, it must absolutely be experienced. Therefore, to understand pistis, let us go back 700 years in the past to Magna Graecia, in a town called Elea, where the Pythagorean iatromantis Parmenides encountered the goddess. As a priest of Apollo, Parmenides would have been familiar with the Apolline oracle that says it knows, quote, the measures of the sea. These are truths that are revealed not to the masses, but to the poets and prophets. We began this video with a casual connection between speech and song, and how these two modes of expression pave a road that lead us to places we'd never anticipate, while physically and concretely taking us nowhere. Carl Muley believed that these paths related to shamanistic ideas of journeying, to realms of knowledge that are occluded or hidden from the unperceiving eye. In the Works and Days, Hesiod speaks of the Heliconian muses, whom, quote, made me walk upon the path of singing. Parmenides similarly wrote a poem that, when performed, replicates the heightened state of awareness and perception and the mystical movement into the depths of one's being. And this poem, divided in 3 parts, begins with a section called a proem, which is derived from the Greek proiomion, which is translated as the portion of the performance that comes before the main theme. Now, embedded within proiomion is the word oime. The plural is oimai, and these are translated as paths. In Homeric usage, these oimai were referred to in such a manner that they were perceived as a spatialization of poetic speech. Verbal words paving concrete paths that lead a singer or a poet to progress through the landscape of thought and images. In the Odyssey, Phemius defends himself against Odysseus by proclaiming that, quote, "I am self-taught, and the muse has made stories, oimai, of every kind grow in my heart." Personally, I sense an irony to this statement, since the word oime can also be translated as a story, but most importantly, a story that the poet has learned from the muses. Phemius is boastfully speaking of being self-taught, while also acknowledging the inspiration and participation of the muse. But to appreciate the parallels between singing, reciting poetry or storytelling, and traveling down roads, it is important to note that each of these seemingly disparate activities all involve a forward movement. When one hears a melody, for instance, from the beginning of the first note till the final one, the listener yearns, desires, and wills the song onward to its eventual completion, each note following the other, each space or gap in the music signaling the continuity of the last note to comprise the fabric of the entire theme. Every movement and variation of theme, whether through poetry or song, compels the lifelike movement forward, whether ascending or descending, but rarely remaining horizontal and never static. This forward movement begins in silence that is pregnant with potential before one's life has begun, and ends precisely in that same silence upon death, thereby closing the loop of song and life. The beginning and the end are the same, for who is to say what begins when something ends, and what ends when something begins? We will come to the Homeric conception of telos shortly. To return to Parmenides' poem An Encounter with the Goddess of the Underworld, he begins by describing how the mares or horses carried him on a chariot with the emphasis on the spinning wheels, the kukloi, that take him to the realm of day and night and into Hades and Tartarus. This descent is death, referenced by the famous and often overused saying, quote, "to die before one dies." The goddess teaches Parmenides the foundational principles of logic and reality. In the most incredibly subtle and evocative manner, the goddess reveals to Parmenides that the only path that one can truly travel is the path of what is, aeon. This aeon is absolutely complete and achieved. It is being itself. Since non-being does not exist, all that is left for us is to travel the route of what is. And before you get upset and claim that what is somehow limits the human imagination or human creativity, or even counter with the Judeo-Christian belief in the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, be reminded that virtuality and actuality, although medieval formulations, are still contained within being. As we've said in earlier videos, a thought as well as other non-visible phenomena are not non-being. A sculpture's image not yet chiseled on a large piece of granite lies certainly in potential within the stone, but this potentiality is not non-being. Things not yet manifest to the visible eye still participate in the wholeness of being. This opens up the fullness of existence, of which we only observe a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. In fact, Parmenides has shown that, quote, "all thought is round about reality, round about being important, because the completeness and indivisibility of reality means that it is shaped as a well-rounded ball, in other words, a sphere. The mind itself is attached and committed to the aeon. The mind cannot seek out anything but the what is. In fact, the very thing that ties the mind to reality is pistis. Faith is a commitment and confidence in the speech of the god or the muse, which realizes fidelity of the words that are transmitted from divinity to humanity. But it is also the fidelity, the pledge, the reliance, and trustworthiness of the truth of what is said by the goddess and the muses, and the truthfulness of what is bound by justice, also known as dike, to the real. Pistis acts as the binding power between constraint, fate, and justice in the real, but it somehow softens the aggressiveness of cosmic justice and compulsion by acting as a civilizing force that proposes an agreement between it and reality. Reality itself ultimately, quote, identifies with its limits or bounds and accepts them willingly. Through a self-direction and self-identity, reality does not veer away from the bounds and limits enclosed by faith and justice. It does not need the opinions of others to validate or confirm it. It does not sway from the divine norm that was established by the gods. This, quote, force of Pistis actually prevents the process of generation from taking place. Despite all the movement and apparent dynamism of reality, nothing, in fact, changes. Change is a perception that is marked by time, and it is only mortal beings that perceive change as a constant flux without sensing the deeper stillness that allows for such apparent change to occur. By exiling generation and coming to be, Pistis maintains the relation of mind to reality. After all, if everything is constantly coming to be and generating and dying away in every instant, then nothing would remain stable in the world. Our entire conception of the world and reality would be constantly thrown into chaos and instability. No obligations or agreements would be able to form between mortals and the divine, and the theurgist would not be able to even contemplate the beginning of the process of anagoge and henosis with the divine if Pistis is not acting as the fundamental bridge that links up with truth and eros. A firm foundation to reality is absolutely necessary, and this is the pledge the divine gives us through our faith. Therefore, Pistis in this older sense is not belief or conviction. Pistis quite literally holds the cosmos together along with justice, fate, constraint, and persuasion, and ensures that reality is bound within its proper limits. For nearly all of humanity, the issue, the goddess assures Parmenides, is that mortal men value doxai, which is opinion, appearance, and belief, which she says does not contain any true fidelity. Their views are therefore untrustworthy, like false promises, hollow claims, unfulfilled commitments. These are things that are devoid of pistis. Therefore, because they lack this virtue, these unfulfilled commitments cannot be consummated, and they cannot be subdued by fate and justice. When something cannot be consummated because it is not bound by the circle of justice that encases reality, there is no telos, which by its nature is circular. Let us speak for a moment of telos. In Homer's Odyssey, he describes teleo as, quote, effecting or consummating a journey. As Odysseus travels to Ithaca, it is his cleverness and correct use of knowledge combined with his constant thinking and yearning for his destination that finally allows him to return safe and sound to his home. A route that is not firmly committed to this ultimate destination is the route of every person who relies on doxai, belief, opinions, and convictions, and because of it, they continue to wander another route that promises no return. This is boundlessness. This is aimless wandering and resultant frustration, things that make us exiles and wanderers in the world, also known as plane. It is truly a pitiable state that we find ourselves in, constantly distracted from engaging in the deepest experiences of reality. Similar to the thought of Parmenides, Heraclitus believed that the logos was common to everyone, since it underlined the structure of reality. Therefore, there was a sense of givenness about the experiences of the everyday, a just so, or what is, regarding reality. But even though we can access reality because it constitutes absolutely everything and lies just in front of our noses, Heraclitus, like Parmenides, also believed that it was incredibly difficult for the typical person to recognize this reality, and insisted that it required a certain level of openness and perception from the individual. However, this is not a pessimistic evaluation, since even though man can wander from the real, he can never fully escape it, for justice and fate hold it tightly bound in fetters. But the beauty is that our sense perception, or our sensation, provides us an endless means to commit to the goddess and her muses, who continually invite us to experience reality in all its fullness and indivisibility. That bond with the superior natures of divinity is what helps establish the grounding between the mind and reality, which is precisely faith, or pistis. After all, aletheia, or truth, cannot exist without the muses, cannot exist without pistis. Because pistis was not primarily understood as belief or conviction, this allowed Parmenides to avoid the dualism between deception, or apate, and truth, aletheia. Truth can be used to deceive, and deception may be used to reveal the truth. So here lies the error of the hermeneutes of suspicion and all of critical modernity, who seek to unmask and discard all false appearances in order to reveal the stark reality beneath. It is not through running away from deception or discarding it that we overcome it, but through acknowledging it as a part of reality and walking right through it with open eyes. Later, Empedocles, as a disciple of Parmenides, will speak in his poem about the uses made of the senses in approaching reality. For now, let me end with a slightly cryptic quote from Empedocles that speaks to much of what we have discussed in the instructions for such work. Perverse people make a habit of disobeying their superiors. You, though, perceive just as the pledges from our muse command, after splitting what I am saying in your entrails. Open your senses and perceive well, my friends. Take care for now.